What comes to your mind when I say the JFK shooting, 9/11, or even Donald Trump in 2016? Well, many people who study generations think of them in the lines of events that happen to a cohort or large group of people. But what if I told you that the most important factor that influences us as Generation Z is something that they miss entirely? So let's look into it. We're all familiar with those articles that they put on BuzzFeed and Huffington Post, a lot of other clickbait news organizations that give us oh, you'll recognize this if you're truly Gen Z, or if you're a millennial, here are several things you'll know or have experienced, or do you have first-hand accounts of this particular event? One great example of this for past generation would be for the baby boomers and the JFK assassination. They all ask each other, and I've actually watched this with my grandparents when they meet people, like, oh, where were you when JFK was assassinated? That's a big thing that they go through. And we have the same events. For us, it might be something like George Floyd, or I think the pandemic is a huge one. Another big one, I would say, would be Donald Trump and his election. However, though these big events have impacted us, have changed our lives, there's a big difference when it comes to those big events that happen on the grand scale and the small daily events that impact us in and out. So several of these all focus on technology. Technology is a bit of a catch-all term for a lot of different things. One of them might be video games, another one might be social media, but a huge one, of course, is smartphones and how they interact and play with our lives, from how we interact with other people and even how we view ourselves. All of these factors seem to come together to push us in a certain direction, and that direction is toward individuality. Jean Twenge, who is a professor at San Diego University and also a preeminent expert on generations, talks about how these things push us toward individualism and individuality. And what she means by that is that over time, we've gone from a culture more focused on communitarianism, collectivism, where you're trying to do better, be better for your community. You're trying to meet certain expectations of your family and of those around you. You're trying to fit in. And now we live more in a society where you need to make something of yourself. You need to focus on who you are, be yourself, believe in yourself. All of these things push us in that direction of towards the self. When I say individualism, I'm not necessarily talking about some sort of gun-toting survivalist in a bunker somewhere. I'm talking about a different mode of thinking. In the past, people were in tribes, they were in groups, they were in families, they were in towns and communities. They thought in that way. They thought about how other people would treat them, how other people would view them, and now that idea has changed. In the present, our technology has become more insular, more isolating, and it has its own negative effects. But some of the effects are to make us feel like we are more important. Because with just a click of the button, we can do so much. Things that would have taken many other people, sometimes groups, towns, cities worth of people, and in more cases, even more than that amount of people. One big thing that you hear people talk about a lot is that in our pocket is a computer more capable, more powerful than the ones that got us to the moon. And so that power is now vested in us as individuals, which leaves us without the same level of community, but also with an increased individuality or push toward uniqueness, toward being ourselves and being the person that we choose to be. This has had a lot of effects in how we as a generation, Gen Z, view the world, because that's happened a lot across time, but it's gotten even worse now, or even larger now. The effect has gotten larger, because there are some really big, important, positive effects of that. She talks about in the book how the places that are most individualistic were also some of the first to be pro-gay marriage, to have that level of tolerance that would allow sexual minorities to be who they wanted to be. Now, also, that comes with a downside, where our generation feels more anxious, depressed, more lonely than it has in the past, because what binds us together often is developing the bonds of trust. We have to depend upon other people when we need them to do things for us. If we don't need them to do things for us, if we can do everything ourselves, then that level of trust, of community, is lost. It's away from us because we can go into an app and we can download something that would allow us to do many things that in the past people would need an entire group to do. Before, they used to use, rather than having some sort of scientific calculator that could do complex equations, they would have to use an abacus. And we'll edit one in right now. But an abacus was this thing where you had to slide across little beads in order to count things. I remember when I was younger, I had that in the nursery I grew up in, and it was crazy to think about. I didn't even know that they would use that to calculate large numbers. Sometimes in the past, I believe it was even used for a census of people, so counting all that were in a certain city, town, or nation. And that's how they would calculate things, which is crazy to our generation to think about that. In an era of Snapchat, in an era of social media, where we can do so many things. And yet, without that, we lose that bond between people. So at the same time, we're liberated to be the people we want to be, but also we feel more isolated than we've ever been. And that's one of the fascinating consequences of technology, which has led us to one more aspect that has become a big part of who we are as Gen Z. The last part that this all flows into is what she calls the slow life strategy. Jean Twenge talks about in her book about, in the past, we used to have what's called the fast life strategy. This is a theory of how we live our lives and how we develop as humans. And in the fast life strategy, we raise our children to grow up more quickly because their responsibilities are fewer, meaning they don't have to have a long education in order to make what they need to make. They don't have a scarce amount of resources. And furthermore, there isn't a high level of infant mortality. Infant mortality used to be one of the biggest reasons why the average standard of living, the average, I should say, lifespan, was much lower when you look in, for instance, the Middle Ages. Because so many of the deaths were young children. Young children when they were first being born, because it was so difficult in many ways to have children. That's why when you look back and you read a biography or you hear about a history, you'll hear so many times that these people in the past would have many children, and yet only 5 brothers and sisters, or only 6, or only 3, because either the mother or the children that she was birthing died in childbirth. And that's a big reason for the shift and how people develop. She says that infant mortality impacted that because as we went up through the 80s, 90s, and into the early 2000s, our generation, infant mortality had gone to an astronomical low. So because of that, there were many more people. And when you have many more people, then there is scarcity of resources, for one, but second, you treat your children much more differently than when you just have to basically pump out as many kids as you can in order to even have children, because so many were perishing at a young age. So because of that, she talks about the slow versus fast life strategy. So the fast life strategy, once again, is when you have lots of children, of course, and then they develop very quickly. So she talks about how the silent generation, it was not unheard of for them to have marriages even in their early teenage years. In fact, my great-grandmother was married at about 14 or 15 years old. And that was not at all uncommon or even frowned upon. And yet when you look today, if even a 19-year-old of Generation Z were to get married, we all would look at, are they religious? Is something going on? They would be looked at differently and in an odd way compared to everyone else. So that is a great example of that change when it comes to the slow life versus the fast life strategy. And now let's talk about the slow life strategy. The slow life strategy is one where the focus on education, for instance, is much higher. Because in order for us to make something of ourselves, in order for us to be who we want to be, we need to go down a certain career path. In the past, many of these paths of what you would do in order to make ends meet were very different, and often very short term. You would start a job, they would teach you how to do it, and you do it. It'd be something normally of manual labor that would require stacking, farming, the list goes on. But a lot of them were either manufacturing jobs or jobs you'd have to do with your hands, that you'd have to be on a factory line, and that would allow you to make ends meet for your family. However, now with automation and once again technology, that is totally changed. Now we're at a very different place, where in order to make a name for yourself, in order to make enough money, in order to have a family, you're going to need to have a certain level of education. Education is a big part of it. But another part is, when you have fewer children, you invest more in those children. And thus, the amount of time, of effort that goes into those children are far more. Rather than kind of pushing them out to be who they want to be on their own and to make themselves, etc., etc. Instead, now you're taking them to soccer practice. Now they have tutors. And so all of that development grows. And many people, when they look at Generation Z, they might judge us or say, wow, they look so young, they seem so young, they're so immature. But a lot of that is because how we're raising children has changed as a society, as a culture, and even as a family unit. All of these factors, that is technology and its increase in individualism leading to a slow life strategy, have come together to create what I think are some of the foundational elements of what it means to be Gen Z and what makes up our generation and the common experiences we have. Because while it's easy to look at things like the pandemic, which was difficult and something that I think many other generations won't understand that we went through, still though, the daily activities we do, our daily habits, our routines, how we look at the world is shaped by much more fundamental factors, much deeper, more ingrained traits that we have together as a generation. And those of course, like I've talked about, is technology, how that's made us more individualistic, how now we're more free to be the people we want to be, while at the same time more isolated, more alone, and feeling like we don't have the connections that we would like. So this all pushes us toward the slow life strategy. And once again, the slow life strategy is when children get more of an investment because there are fewer of them, and also the world has put us in a place where in order to be who we want to be our individual self, we must learn more, understand more, and discover who we are. And all of that takes a lot more time, a lot more energy, and a lot more resources. And so our lives have somewhat slowed down. All of this to me, like I said, forms the backbone of what I think it means to be Generation Z and what we all struggle with. So that's been a look into some of the foundational aspects of what it means to be Generation Z. Another time, I would really like to have some personal stories. I'll talk about how I've experienced some of the things in this video, and I would love to hear from you about how you've experienced it as well. So we'll look into it then.